This video is the second part in a series where I intend to examine the culture surrounding video games from the lens of an anthropologist. The intent of this series is to invite discussion about language used in video games as well as the culture surrounding them. Anthropology is a discipline about studying people, particularly with a focus on cultural practices and behavior, and is just one of many avenues to understand that human behavior. I want people to watch this series and be able to think about what I've said and how they engage with video games as a medium. I want to hear from you in the comments about the concepts that I will be introducing in this video and the next. Video games are meant to entertain. Some succeed and become timeless classics, and others fail and fade into obscurity, though a select few find their way into the halls of infamy. A deadline set too soon for a development team to meet is the downfall of many games. Other times the technology available simply doesn't allow for what the concept may call for. Regardless, what often matters most is the game's reception on release. Through word of mouth and reviews by journalists, games are bought and discussed. In this video, I'll talk a bit about how games are seen as good or bad from the framework of linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology is a subset of the discipline that examines culture by looking at the words spoken in a language. This includes dialect or slang specific to a certain group of people. What I'll be examining specifically will be language used to describe the quality of a game, good or bad. But before I begin, it's important to stress that games have wildly different genres and target audiences similar to other forms of media. Often games with apparent flaws are still enjoyed. Each game must be engaged on its own terms. A game with a focus on storytelling, like a role-playing game, will not be judged the same way as a game that focuses more on creating engaging mechanics. You wouldn't judge Transformers the same way you would judge The Shining, because these two films set out to do very different things in their narratives and presentation, and you can assume differences in the target audience for each film. The same applies to different genres of video games. They're often evaluated on certain parameters within said genre rather than by an overarching scale for all video games. Games are supposed to be quote-unquote fun, but fun is different for every person. Which is to say that what makes a game good depends on personal preference as much as any kind of media. Because of this subjectivity, I'll be taking examples from two separate genres to assess: the Metroidvania platformers and roguelikes. A Metroidvania, named after two pioneering games in the genre, is an exploration-based platformer that boasts a lot of content, both in story and gameplay. These games tend to take a long time to play, as they slowly give the player more abilities that can be used to more fully explore the large map given to them. Hollow Knight is a critically acclaimed Metroidvania taking place in the husk of a kingdom of bugs. As the player slowly uncovers more of the world, a bigger picture unfolds of what has transpired to make the kingdom fall. To describe this game, players call it beautiful, compelling, rewarding, and challenging. They also comment on the feel of the controls, that they feel good or are satisfying. In contrast, Chasm is a game that uses randomly generated maps instead of a preset design. The game has mixed reviews, mostly to do with this aspect of the game. This game is described as repetitive, clunky, and unchallenging. Games are largely subjective, as I talked about in my last video. It was all about my personal experience with games, because I wanted to talk about just how personally affecting playing a video game can be. That being said, there are some shared experiences between players because they've played the same game or the same kinds of games, and they have a sort of language that develops between them when discussing these games in order to be able to engage with those games and recommend new games to other players that may be interested in the same genres. Now, in the specific case of a Metroidvania, what makes it good that a Metroidvania is beautiful? What does looks have to do with a video game? Well, when you consider the fact that most Metroidvanias involve you going back to the same area several times, and the area will often remain largely unchanged, it's important for the game to look good, because if it doesn't look good, then the player may lose interest in the fact that they have to return to the same spot. For instance, in Hollow Knight, every environment is meticulously crafted. It's a beautiful game to look at. It's for that reason that the word beautiful has an extremely positive connotation when speaking about Metroidvanias. If the background is nice to look at, then it doesn't get old to look at as quickly. Especially when backtracking through the same area more than once. Oftentimes you'll be going through this area several, up to 10 or more times through a single playthrough of a game, and it never wants to feel old. The other words that are considered positive are also largely subjective. What exactly is compelling and rewarding and challenging? I find that challenge out of all of these is the most difficult to really quantify, because everybody has a different idea of what challenge can be. In particular, challenge is a pretty contentious thing to talk about in video games, because everybody's idea of difficulty is different, because everybody has different capabilities. Some people aren't as dexterous. They have issues with their hands that prevent them from being able to complete challenges that other people may find very easy. Difficulty in video games is often based off of one's hand-eye coordination, their experience in games in said genre, and also their own dexterity, whether or not they are able to react in time with a button press. That being said, it does mostly boil down to experience in a genre, or several other players out there who... I know that I personally found Hollow Knight to be a very difficult game, and it is largely subjective. However, generally, challenge is seen as a very good thing in video games. If a game is challenging, then completing that challenge feels very rewarding. So when a game is reviewed and it is said to be very challenging, that is often seen as a good thing, especially if they later follow it up by how the game feels. When talking about a game's quality, players will most often speak about how a game feels. They will say that the controls are satisfying and that the controls are responsive, or to say that a game doesn't quite quote-unquote feel right. They may say that the controls feel a bit floaty, or that the controls are unresponsive. If you've played video games, if you have held a controller in your hand, and a game has ever responded to your inputs promptly and done exactly as you intended for it to do, then you understand when a reviewer says that a game is responsive. You understand that that game will immediately read your inputs, and they will translate to the game world as quickly as possible. On the other hand, if a game is clunky or unresponsive or even floaty, then a player will understand that to mean that their inputs may not be immediately read, or that even if they are read, that the resulting action in the game may not have the weight that they expect it to. A roguelike is a game with randomized elements, usually randomly generated items making the player stronger as they progress into more dangerous areas in the game. There are many notable examples in this genre, both good and bad, but the consensus is mixed on the genre as a whole, due to mechanics that are primarily based on luck. There are skills that one can use to get better at a roguelike, but most of your progression will still be tied to luck. Players report dissatisfaction with having little to no control over their progress. Instead, they enjoy games that are based on skill. An analysis of reviews for several roguelikes suggests that many players will complain that a roguelike can be repetitive and unforgiving when based entirely on luck. When your progress is taken due to circumstances out of your control, it can be extremely frustrating, and when a game is too much of the same, the player can become bored easily. Roguelikes also offer the experience of gaining vast power on the other side of the same coin when the game gives you lucky items. Within these two genres, we can draw conclusions about what can be considered good or bad within a game. Good qualities for a game include responsive controls, challenging encounters, and a sense of progression and reward. Bad qualities are the discouragement of repeated playthroughs, reliance on luck, and related to that, a lack of player agency. Being an interactive medium, players tend to enjoy feeling as though their actions have impact in the world of a game. Games are a means for players to feel stronger and more capable than they are in real life, and many players enjoy feeling that their efforts have been rewarded. For example, reviews for Doom Eternal occasionally use the term power fantasy to describe the game, referring to the fact that players are put in control of a large, muscular man with a wide arsenal of weapons as he single-handedly plows through armies of demons. This power fantasy is seen as a positive. While it is purely fantasy, as the phrase would suggest, the game makes players feel accomplished and powerful by placing them in this role. Most games are designed with this feedback loop in mind. The player uses the tools given to them at the start to progress, and the game rewards them with additional means to explore and progress further. Hollow Knight is also built on this foundation, making progression rewarding and engaging. More secrets of the world are revealed to the player as they are able to traverse the map, making the very act of playing the game rewarding. But when the game has luck-based mechanics, losses can feel unfair and unearned. Because roguelikes are often based on luck, their mechanics can be controversial. These mechanics lead to these games being very difficult to complete since they are out of the player's control. Darkest Dungeon is a good example. Everything from the heroes the player can use to the encounters and layout of the maps are randomized. As such, Darkest Dungeon works the difficulty from the luck into the nature of the game itself. Damage, chances to hit, and even the kinds of enemies encountered are randomized. The game teaches you not to get attached to any certain hero, and that people will die under your care. That is the reality you must accept when playing. A hero you've had since the start will be killed by an errant bite from a giant spider, or a wandering boss will consume your entire party, or your hero will turn into a vampire and go mad with bloodlust. A lot of people really enjoy Darkest Dungeon, where many others find it unfair and oppressive. Because of the randomized nature of the game, characters that players have invested a large amount of time in can die in any encounter thanks to the bad luck and little else. This unceremonious disposal of something the players have worked very hard to earn can feel extremely unrewarding, which is what many negative responses to the game express. The reason why luck in video games is fairly contentious is because it can both make a player feel really good, or it can make them feel as if they have no control over their actions. When a game makes a player feel as though they have no control, it's generally a very bad thing. Video games are built on the idea that a player has agency. Most games give players almost complete control over their avatars. So if a game makes the player feel as if they have no control and that their actions don't matter, especially when it comes down to random chance, there's a very good chance that players will feel more frustrated than they do rewarded. It's a very difficult thing to balance, but when you understand that randomness and chance are fairly easy to integrate into a game, you understand why there are so many roguelikes on the market, and why a lot of them tend to be very middling as far as player reception goes, because it's difficult to make a game based around luck. Even though hypothetically a roguelike can be played forever, if a roguelike does not have a wide variety of items to give the player, then the player will feel as though they've already exhausted their options, and the replay value of the game will be fairly low. The player will not feel compelled to play the game again and again and again, which is the point of a roguelike, to have a wide variety of items that the player can potentially get, so that every run of the game will be different and equally rewarding and challenging. So, from the perspective of linguistic analysis, inevitably in a game based off of luck, players will have moments where it feels unfair, but if it happens enough that they bring it up in their review, it tends to be a bad thing. Luck tends to have negative connotations when it comes to games, because luck suggests a lack of player agency, and for a lot of players that is not a good thing. Ultimately, what I've found is that players have wildly different tastes, but each genre they may pick from offers a different means of satisfying desire. Most commonly, players like to feel more capable than they are in reality, and their choices have an impact on the world around them. Others simply enjoy managing people or building virtual sites, be it cities or planets or theme parks. Video games are a means of escape where people can be whatever they may like, and reality within them is their own. In the final part of this series, we will examine what happens when this reality begins to break down for the players.